Mysterious neighbor. In a quiet, peaceful neighborhood, people were connected through neighborly relationships. However, at one end of the neighborhood lived Mrs. Johnson, representing the dark side within everyone. She was a quiet and mysterious woman, and other neighbors avoided interacting with her because her eyes always gleamed with an odd coldness. One day, Emily, a young and curious woman from the neighborhood, became Mrs. Johnson's neighbor. Emily knew her neighborhood to be warm and friendly, so she was determined to unravel the mystery behind Mrs. Johnson's calm demeanor. She was initially greeted with a polite hello, but over time, Mrs. Johnson's peculiar behavior began to capture her attention. One evening, as Emily was cooking in her home, she heard strange sounds outside her door. When she went out, she noticed a strange circle in Mrs. Johnson's yard filled with mysterious symbols. Intrigued, she knocked on Mrs. Johnson's door to inquire about the meaning of these symbols. However, no one answered the door. The next day, as Emily roamed the neighborhood, she heard from other neighbors that they were disturbed by Mrs. Johnson's behavior and harbored suspicions about her. Some even claimed she might be linked to an old murder. Learning about these rumors only fueled Emily's curiosity. One night, Emily decided to wander around Mrs. Johnson's house. While peering through a window, she witnessed a bizarre ritual taking place inside. The walls were adorned with symbols drawn in blood, and burnt images lay among the candles. Emily stood frozen for a moment. Suddenly, Mrs. Johnson looked directly at Emily through the window. Her eyes were colder than ever, and Emily recoiled in fear. Emily, avoiding Mrs. Johnson's cold gaze, heard the words uttered by the woman's lips. "Secrets are hidden in the darkness, and you have a secret too." At that moment, all the lights in the neighborhood went out abruptly. A dark laughter mingled with Emily's scream. Then, strange sounds from Mrs. Johnson's house combined into a melody that intoxicated the entire neighborhood. Doors and windows shook and shadows danced everywhere. Terrified, Emily ran back to her home, but Mrs. Johnson's house remained engulfed in darkness. Emily, trembling in her bed, woke up to the dream of strange symbols every night. The melody from Mrs. Johnson's house dragged her into nightmares. One day, other neighbors began to see strange symbols and hear odd sounds. Everyone confronted their own fears. Emily realized that everything in the neighborhood had a dark secret, and the mysterious power emanating from Mrs. Johnson's house connected everyone. Eventually, the people in the neighborhood succumbed to the presence of Mrs. Johnson's mysterious entity, disappearing into a silent darkness. New Year's Eve in the cursed house. Alice had made plans with her friends for New Year's Eve in a small mountain cabin nestled in the midst of a snowy forest. They aimed to make the New Year's night unforgettable. However, there was something they were unaware of. This cabin had been the scene of peculiar events years ago. As the group cheerfully arrived at the cabin, they were greeted by a snowy atmosphere, yet, upon entering, instead of hearing the creaking of old wooden floorboards, silence prevailed. Once settled in, they lit the historical fireplace next to the woodpile, creating a warm atmosphere. As the hours passed, The howling wind outside and the rustling of the snow emphasized the silence enveloping the inside even more. While Alice choked with her friends, she discovered a book in the corner of the woodpile. In its old leather cover it read, "Homeowners and Their Histories." Curiously, Alice opened the book and began examining the history of the mountain cabin. The book recounted the history of this mountain cabin, dating back to the mid-1800s, when it was once inhabited by a family who mysteriously disappeared on a New Year's Eve. After the family vanished under mysterious circumstances, the house was abandoned. However, the ghost of the missing family members reappeared on New Year's Eves. Alice thought of this story as a mere legend, but a sense of unease began to creep over her. When midnight struck, a strange shadow appeared in the corner of the room. As Alice explained the situation to her friends, everyone smiled at each other. However, the room's lights suddenly went out, and the fireplace's fire extinguished. In the darkness that engulfed the room, strange sounds began to be heard. Alice's heart began to race. Everyone huddled together in fear, looking around anxiously. Suddenly, a pale light appeared in the middle of the room, revealing family members dressed in 1800s attire. Alice and her friends recoiled in horror. The ghostly family began to move around the room, without uttering a word. According to the book, Alice remembered, this family had appeared on the New Year's Eve. They went missing, each one, like a ghost from the past, wandered with a sorrowful expression. Seeing her friends trembling in fear, Alice decided to find a solution. On the last page of the book, the notes for an old piano song played by the family on the night they disappeared were written. Alice found an old piano in the room and quickly began to play the song. After the piano sound echoed, Alice and her friends felt as if they had managed to stop the ghostly family from wandering. However, a mysterious mist suddenly appeared in the middle of the room. As the mist spread rapidly, the ghostly family members turned with a terrifying scream, transforming into shadows. Alice and her friends withdrew in astonishment, but the mist surrounded them, compressing them with an invisible force. As screams rose from all sides of the room, darkened shadows enveloped them. When the mist dissipated, Alice and her friends had disappeared. The mountain cabin seemed to have returned to silence. The fireplace fire that illuminated the room suddenly went out. Left behind were the ghosts of another group of people who had disappeared on a New Year's Eve. The mountain cabin continued to carry the curse of the past. New Year's Eve had ended in an unforgettable nightmare. At the foothills, a young man named Gale, living in a distant village, discovered an old and abandoned mountain house among the villagers. Rumors circulated about strange events that had occurred in the house in ancient times. Gale, setting aside his fears, decided to satisfy his curiosity and leer. One evening, Gale set out towards the mountain house with a few friends. As the night fell, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Upon reaching the house, the old wooden door creaked open. Inside, they were met with a dusty atmosphere, and the silence within seemed like an eerie melody. Gale and his friends began to explore every room in the house. As they wandered among old items and dusty curtains, mysterious sounds suddenly echoed, footsteps, as if coming from the depths of the house, were audible, yet no one was in sight. Then, in a room, they found a peculiar notebook filled with symbols. Flipping through the pages, they discovered signs indicating that the house's former inhabitants were engaged in mysterious rituals. A growing fear enveloped Gale, but with the courage derived from being with his friends, they kept. Suddenly, they heard high-pitched screams from one of the rooms. Everyone rushed there, and behind the door stood a pale figure in front of an old painting on the wall. The figure turned towards them and began speaking in a deep voice. "You should not be here. You must leave and leave." Gale and his friends recoiled in horror. However, they were immediately confronted with an intense fog that materialized. The fog surrounded them, separating each one from the others. Gale found himself alone in the midst of the fog, screaming in fear. When the fog finally dissipated, Gale was left alone in the mountain house. Everything around him seemed normal, but his friends had disappeared one by one. Gale hurriedly left the house and returned to the village. But the events he experienced left a deep imprint of fear in his mind. The families of Gale's friends became concerned about the whereabouts of their children. When they narrated the incident to Gale, they came to believe that Gale had gone mad and killed their children. They immediately called the police, and Gale was admitted to a mental hospital. The truth behind the events remained uncertain, and Gale, confined to the mental hospital, began his struggle against his own nightmares. We have reached the end of our story. Until we meet again in another horror tale.